Hello friends, welcome to Auf Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. The date is Thursday, the 8th of July. My name is Alex Oakley, and I'm here present in the same room looking at and almost in touching distance of George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe, which is quite exciting. Hello guys.
Hey.
Yeah, that's quite an intro. It is quite exciting.
Almost touching distance. Almost, incredible.
But,
it's very unusual. I think we must have done maybe 5 episodes in the same room, so at max, I would say.
Out of 200.
Yeah, shit.
Well, 203 or whatever this is
we
now.
actually have to look at each other. It's disconcerting. All right.
These very sly visual cues we're giving each other. What do you mean? I can't read body language. Anyway, so this is
I'm a podcaster.
Yeah. It's just an automaton. This is a 3 articles, which is, if you're not familiar, is a type of episode where we each bring an article to discuss on a completely different theme from different sources, and we discuss them. So it's a bit of a show and tell. And we've actually got quite a big range of themes to discuss today, and that are all international, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. We are talking about the Chinese economy. We're talking about Switzerland in the EU or out of the EU. And we're talking about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And we're going to start, I think, more or less in that order. So George is going to talk about the first one.
Yeah, I think we'll do it probably in exactly that order, in fact. So the first one is mine. It's from the FT, and it's titled, "What Happens If Chinese Household Wealth is Unleashed on the World?" from the 6th of July 2021 by Thomas Hale and Tabby Kinder. So yeah, I thought this was a really interesting article about essentially the capital controls that are in China. Currently, Chinese citizens are able to take $50,000 out of the country annually. Other than that, it has to stay within the PRC, and this had previously been biased towards spending particularly on education and investment in their children.
So like private education.
Yeah, private education. Some interesting sort of bubbles about how do you make this. Is there a way to get round this 50 grand limit? Is there ways that you can kind of pay consultants of various sorts to get your kids into the best schools? Obviously very important in the intensely meritocratic education system at the higher end of Chinese society. But anyway, the article talks about a review potentially to change this, and I think just something about the scale of the of this sort of thing. The estimate by HSBC is that Chinese households will have 300 trillion renminbi, which is $46.3 trillion US dollars of investable assets by 2025. So this is equivalent to the entire US bond market. And I think the conclusion of the article is that any opening up, so any ability for Chinese citizens to invest abroad, will be extremely gradual, but it's possible. I think this is what this article talks about, that there's a possibility for the capital controls on the investments of the rising Chinese middle class to be lifted. So that's the basic premise of the article. It also notes the very high savings rate of Chinese citizens compared to the rest of the world. And there's some interesting points as well, I think, on Hong Kong as a kind of a gateway between the mainland and the rest of the world. So yeah, so this was my choice for 3 articles this time, let's just say.
So like the implication of all this is basically there's huge savings. I mean, of the 1.6 billion Chinese, obviously a small proportion of that actually has household savings, but the savings rate in China is much higher, right, than in most advanced countries, and that money has to go somewhere.
Yeah, and the economy, and also just the amount of wealth that has been built up in China as the economy has grown and expanded, and that it's all compressed essentially. Because the Chinese don't want to, the Chinese Communist Party is slowly moving towards liberalization of its financial institutions within China.
Yeah.
So, but on the one hand, they're afraid of hot money off the back of the Asian financial crisis, so money flooding in if they liberalize.
Yeah.
And they also want very tight control over what Chinese households do with their cash. And so it's a slow kind of drip experimental way in which they're very slowly liberalizing.
Yeah.
I suppose, from my point of view, I guess the numbers are all, as ever with China and the Chinese economy, the numbers are just absolutely outstanding in terms of the
best.
Very good
astounding,
numbers.
not outstanding. I'm a bit slow today. So the enormity of everything is always kind of, really striking.
Yeah, like you just let a little bit of money out and suddenly it actually amounts to a huge flood of finance kind of laying onto the world economy.
Yeah, I guess there were two things that struck me then kind of for the long run. One is the banks that are essentially, I mean, as far as I could tell, reading between the lines, or maybe it was just even explicit, but the large Western banks who are engaging basically in losing operations in order, because they're banking on the liberalization, which they'll be in a position to benefit from further down the road through laying the ground now, even though it's very expensive for them. And I suppose the upshot of that is then you have Western banks, large Western banks that are still, despite the growing kind of geopolitical tensions and trade wars between West and East, they're still deeply invested, and they will lobby governments to get access to all that Chinese money. And the other end of it, I guess, is the Chinese middle classes. How much will they bridle against the restrictions of the Chinese Communist Party if they want to have kind of better returns on their investment abroad, more secure pensions, more secure financial assets, better growth, and how far there's friction there. And that the article didn't really go into.
Yeah, so I think there are two things that the article doesn't really go into, but are the kind of the real implications of this. And the first is, what are the current effects of the capital controls that are in place on, I guess, the formation of the Chinese bourgeoisie, if you want to put it that way, in the context of the sort of state capitalism that China has. And secondly, what would be the effects of liberalizing these capital controls? And you touch on this. You have these fund managers who'll become fantastically wealthy. You can almost hear them salivating in the article, because the numbers are absolutely gigantic, and the any opening up there creates a massive opportunity for any intermediaries to make a ton of money. But yeah, I mean, on the other side, the potential destabilizing influence to the world economy, or the flooding of international accounts. Could this collapse the renminbi? Could this collapse the Chinese currency? I think there's a lot of implications of this, and I think the article is kind of right to the extent that it concludes that any change would have to be very slow, because it risks the Chinese Communist Party losing control to a certain extent if people are able to invest this money overseas. What does that do in terms of the Chinese state's ability to control investment, its ability to control the rising middle class within China? The more that they invest externally overseas might lead to a kind of a slightly different orientation to the kind of nation-led development program that's been extremely successful in China in the past.
And the Chinese state develops an interest in overseas, kind of control of overseas assets in a way that it thus far has only had for control of resources or access to resources. And so that would change the way in which it would relate to the outside world in theory. So,
but also like that reference to sort of iterative trial and error form of policymaking, where they loosen, open the gates just ever so slightly, raise the limit to which, Chinese can invest abroad. It reminded me, of course, of our recent episode with Isabella Weber, talking about that whole reform and opening up moment in the late 1980s, which was precisely this iterative process. At the same time, this article makes kind of reference to looming storm clouds in different ways. And so one of them is the ballooning corporate debt levels in China, and the other is the asset price bubbles that you have now, with property prices completely ballooning as well. And this is also one of these things where they're having to manage to, keep different plates spinning at the same time. So they want to open up, and so this money doesn't keep getting reinvested into domestic property market, inflating that bubble. And so to put that money out, but then we've already, as Phil was already talking about, the sort of the downside risk of that on the other hand. And so it's something very tricky to manage. And there's always, just to put it in the broader context, this sense of like, China keeps growing, but at some point there's going to be a crisis, right? And we don't know when that's going to be. And you could probably have that conversation 5 years ago. You could have one now. You might be still talking about it in 5 years and for a crisis which hasn't come, but it will come.
And it will, I guess. But that was the takeaway, I think, both from this article and also from the discussion we had with Isabel about the Chinese economic policy in the 80s, was just the skill. Both kind of, political, administrative, that the Chinese state and the Chinese Communist Party, with which they've managed and finessed this process of growth, is, it's remarkable that they've managed to do it so effectively thus far. And that was, I think, more or less the conclusion of the article as well. It was, it kind of accepted that there will be kind of bumps in the road, but that on the basis of its past record, the Chinese Communist Party will probably be able to keep hold of the steering wheel.
So, I mean, I guess one thing that I probably should have said a little bit more in the introduction is just like, imagine if there were capital controls of this sort in place in the US or the UK or wherever the listener is based. I mean, it's quite a surprising system, like in an international comparison, that you have like only $50,000 that you can invest overseas. Like, what does that mean for like the holder of stock is a proprietor of the world, the proprietor of stock is a citizen of the world, as Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations. Book 5, chapter 2, part 2, maybe, possibly.
Maybe.
It is. Anyway, you can find that on you can find that on Marxists.org. Just there you go. Anyway, so what does that mean? That you've had this rising Chinese middle class who have not been able to become citizens of the world in that Smithian sense by owning stock of overseas companies, yet. And how would that change? So that I think is. I mean,
there is a Chinese citizen of the world. I mean, there's an enormous Chinese diaspora. Like in every major city, there's a Chinatown. And that's a different kind of citizen of the world than someone who lives in China or is wealthy and wants education.
It's the citizen of $1 one vote, or $50,000 plus, and $50,000 votes.
Yeah, I don't know.
So they interviewed a guy though, someone who studied an IT worker who studied in Glasgow.
Yeah.
And on the basis of his experience, he is interested in investing abroad. He's a wealthy young Chinese guy. And that's different from the kind of the citizen of the world that is a member of the Chinese diaspora in, essentially service sector stuff in Chinatowns around the world.
Is the difference between a cosmopolitan and a diasporic expat. And that is an important one. Anyway, I think the article is essentially, it's raising this as a possibility, right? And it's not saying, this is it's gonna change everything overnight. I don't think the CCP would do that. And of course, in the previous episode, we learned about trial and error policy successes. So yeah, just something for our listeners to think about.
From the People's Republic of China and overseas investments to the People's Republic of Switzerland, a place which obviously receives many investments and
people's indeed, and a People's Republic for which we have more sympathy because it is much more of a genuine People's Republic.
Well, we have somebody with lived experience of being
Indeed,
Swiss.
We do.
Who should really we should censor his voice.
This is actually my I'm going to talk over our Swiss contributor because this is actually my article. So it's a blog post in Sidecar, which is the blog of New Left Review by Wolfgang Streeck, the German professor, friend of the pod. And what it's about is it's about Swexit. So recently, Switzerland repudiated a framework agreement with the European Union, which was intended to systematize a whole series of bilateral agreements, treaties, and so on, arrangements, which have developed in the course of managing the relationship between the European Union and Switzerland. And so, I mean, Switzerland is not a member, has not been a member of the European Union. So, Swexit is kind of, it's kind of a gloss on the process, but essentially that the framework agreement would have locked Switzerland as into the position of being a subordinate, a satellite of this larger entity, and that effectively the relationship was a hegemonic and imperial one, and the Swiss repudiated it, and that this was an inevitability given the structure of Switzerland's democratic politics, that it's so decentralized, the cantons have so much control, and that the central government is so weak. And at the same time, though, that so much of Swiss political life is determined by plebiscite and by direct democracy, and that Swiss citizens have a much greater degree of control. And it's a great piece. And what I guess, the takeaway, I guess, what was interesting for me was or particularly interesting for me was what it seems the claim is essentially that I think this is a safe one to make, that Switzerland and Britain, as having repudiated the European Union, enjoy a particular kind of political status within Europe. And in particular, that they're seeking to establish their independence separate from this increasingly kind of centralized and imperial structure. And that tells you something about domestic politics in those two countries. And there is one point that Streeck made, which I thought is really interesting and not just of academic interest, but genuinely important, I think, which is I've given his account of why Switzerland repudiated the European Union given its internal domestic structure. But he says for Britain, the way Britain's kind of majoritarian political system as a legacy of the English Revolution and the establishment of parliamentary supremacy, that it requires a particular kind of sovereignty. There was a problem resolved by Britain by having an empire. So the question of British sovereignty and its relations with other nations have never been dealt with or confronted in that way because of Britain's imperial position, hegemonic position in relation to so many other countries. And so the issue of British popular character or the popular basis of British sovereignty has been disguised for a while. And the Swiss have resolved it by being, historically resolved it by being neutral.
So, Phil, this was the second time that you've chosen a Streeck article. So that's 2 Streecks, a third Streeck, and you're out. Yeah, people are laughing.
Who's laughing? Okay, I'm laughing.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Your people. So, I guess one of the things just I think we should talk about quickly at the top is what is Switzerland?
It's a country.
No, what does it represent? I guess because there was an article linked at the bottom of the blog to an older New Left Review article from 1969, which called Switzerland the bourgeois El Dorado, a haven for international capital, an embodiment of the petty bourgeois spirit, and a challenge to Marxist theory on the national question. So I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, that third point relates a little bit to the point that Streeck made about how the British Empire was kind of an externalization of some of these points around the contradictions of all the points around sovereignty that you made.
But Streeck, he appends that, right? So he appends that El Dorado thing because the points he makes are that part of the reason the Swiss have repudiated the EU is because the Swiss organised labour movement is anti-EU, unlike in the case of Britain and in many other countries. So
what I was going to say is that it's interesting then that this bourgeois El Dorado and the kind of Singapore-on-Thames that we have in this country, in the UK, are the two, those are the ways that they're characterised often. These are the two, in some ways, leading nations of Europe in terms of their relationship to the EU. One has left and one won't swentry, which is a word that I hadn't. No. Swiss entry. So it's more of a preemptive Swexit, I think, is the way to.
Well, I mean, I guess the thing, like what you're alluding to, is neither Britain nor Switzerland are particularly popular countries or particularly sympathetic. Their struggles to remain out of or to leave the EU. Hang on. To leave the EU, viewed from abroad, is often, even people who might be generally kind of sympathetic, if they're to Democrats basically, will look at Britain and see the misrepresentation of Brexit as just imperial nostalgia. And in Switzerland, they'll see what Streeck refers to as the Swiss either being bad or mad. So bad in the sense of they don't want to share their riches with other countries, or mad because they don't see their true interests, and their true interest being, collaboration within the EU. And what's good about this is that it actually points out like Switzerland's maybe not such a bad place. There's many criticisms we could make, and maybe we'll get onto some of that. But the fact of, one, it's a democratic constitution is something that's good and should be held on to. And two, the fact that the reason its supposed unwillingness to share its riches is actually workers not wanting to give up on high wages, which is a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, the point that I wanted to make when I was going to interrupt there is, I don't think that Britain is not popular. I think people love Britain, and particularly the constituent nations, and particularly I would say England, and particularly I would say the England football team that won gloriously against Denmark last night.
This is going to be funny because this is going to obviously come out after the final. So is it coming home, George?
I'm putting my neck on the line. No, so it's come home already, and we need to keep it home over the course of the final. I think we will find that it was always home.
Already home.
Always home. That was my joke.
That's like a the Paulo Coelho interpretation of football. You know, you go looking for football everywhere, and it was home all along.
Exactly. Anyway, so that was literally the joke that I made.
But back to Switzerland.
Anyway, so the actually I didn't have a serious point other than that, you know, people hate on these countries, but maybe they hate on them because they're jealous.
Well, but he makes the point. But he makes the point that it's you know, the part of the reasons the snootiness even within the kind of the left liberals of Switzerland, who he says, you know, are expatriates in Germany and so on. They're embarrassed by Switzerland's the kind of the intransigence and stubbornness of Swiss voters, not extending in some parts of Switzerland the franchise to women until the 70s.
Yeah.
The embarrassment of the votes over minarets and migration, and all of these things that are in fact you know, testimony to I mean, it's the stubbornness of voters, and
it can be genuinely a provincial and kind of small-minded place.
But it is nonetheless at the same time testimony to the democratic self-confidence of Swiss citizens. And to that extent, I think, you know, it was a rousing trumpet blast for popular self-government, and well contrasted with the link to the older New Left Review article. The other point he makes, which I think is a good one, is Switzerland's effectiveness. So despite all of its decentralization, he said, you know, they built that section of tunnel much more efficiently and quickly, and you know, within budget compared to the European Union,
and on time as well, because they are very, you know, punctual people.
They are a punctual people
with watches that
not
work
all of their citizens,
well.
Not all of their citizens, but some of their.
We have
citizens.
listeners in Switzerland who are rolling their eyes at us right now, I'm sure. But anyway. What's interesting though is after having read that piece, I read something recently which someone posted about Switzerland undoing its nuclear power plants. You know, kind of shutting them down. And part of the problem, as the article explained, this is another article, is that Switzerland is so federalized that it's very difficult to get anything done. And basically, you have a huge veto power of the NIMBY, of the, you know, not in my backyard constituency. So if you don't want something to be built or something to happen positively, you can stop it. So even one person can petition their cantonal authorities to have something stop something being built. And, you know, you need approval both at the federal level, at different agencies, you know, for the environment and the energy agency, whatever, and at the cantonal level and so on. So that, you know, that level of, you know, I don't want to say that democracy stops you getting things done. That's not the point I'm trying to make. But the particular form that Swiss democracy takes is sometimes an impediment to will formation at a national level.
Yeah.
So yeah, on slightly related to this, I think one of the things that Streeck's articles are always really good on is the understanding of the kind of the national class forces and how they work, and it's very impressive, like a bit like Perry Anderson. It's like, how do you know all this stuff? But his account, I think, of the support for Swentry was that it's this coalition of export-oriented manufacturing and this new class of left liberals. And he notes that in Britain, that coalition was joined by part of the trade union movement, which was hoping for protection from Brussels against an untamed conservative parliamentary majority for less than fully intelligible reasons in light of the dismal social policy performance of Brussels. And I think this is
nicely put.
Yeah, it is quite nicely put. And I think it just shows that there is that the orientation to the EU is there is a class and material aspect, as well as obviously what Streeck himself has talked about, the sacralisation of the EU, which I think we'd all be fairly could bring to mind quite easily in terms of the experience of the past few years. So yeah, and I think one thing that he notes this slogan, which I hadn't heard from the Greens in Germany in the 90s: "Dear foreigners, do not leave us alone. Please do not leave us alone with the Germans." And
that's just incredible. Isn't it?
It's like this Puritan narrowness and this kind of dislike of the domestic populace, which is
your own citizen, of your fellow citizens.
Exactly, and I think that's shot through a lot of contemporary politics. Particularly, I don't want to just talk about the football, but that's why my voice is quite hoarse. I was at Wembley last night, and I saw some bad tweets, man, about people, just people being like, "Oh, look at these bad people celebrating this stupid little game." Well,
that was me, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And also, sorry, when I said tweets, I meant WhatsApp messages. I think a lot of people wanted us to fail, and they were disappointed. And you can't see, but I'm looking at Phil, because he wanted us to fail. And
it's because I
just hope we win on Sunday, because otherwise I'll look like such a idiot when this comes out.
I want Paul West. What is it? Paul West Joseph? What is his name?
Paul Joseph. Wait, the alt-right guy.
Yeah, the conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, Prison Planet, whatever his name is.
Whatever. Anyway, but he says like any team that takes the knee is too cucked to win. And he said they'd be kicked out early, so that's been disproven so far. But
England took the knee and Denmark didn't, and
But Italy don't take the knee.
Ironically, Denmark's captain scored an own goal with about his knee, pretty much. So.
Apparently, he had a laser pointer in his face as well.
No, that was So I didn't see that, and I thought it was a penalty in the ground, and it wasn't. But anyway,
we're getting sidetracked.
Yeah, we are getting sidetracked. This was really about.
This is a sidecar. Well, anyway,
what's the main car? Is the NLR the main car?
I guess. Yeah, it's a great piece, and I strongly I like the kind of the contrast between Britain and Switzerland and their the relationships with the EU. Well worth reading.
Yes, indeed. So, final article, it's mine. It's
Next up.
A piece in the Daily Mail. We haven't ever chosen a piece from the Daily Mail. The reason I've chosen it is because it has lots of pictures, which is nice. Everyone likes pictures.
Particularly on a podcast.
Especially, they're going to listen to my poetics in trying to describe these pictures. I'm not going to do that very much at all. But with the article...
You should, 1,000 words is worth a picture, so why not just... There's 10 pictures in there, so you got 10,000 words.
Okay, here we go. So it's about the US leaving Afghanistan, not just leaving Afghanistan, but leaving it overnight. Basically, they just took up and left in the middle of the night, and the Afghan...
Bagram specifically.
Bagram Air Base, which is their main headquarters in the country. They picked up and left and didn't inform their Afghan supposed partners until they turned up the next day and were like, oh, they've all gone. And the pictures, and so the reason I chose this article, because it's a basic news article with one interesting little tidbit about the history of Bagram Air Base, which was the Soviets' base, which was then left in 1990, and then the US took it over. But the rest of the piece is fairly straightforward. The pictures really paint a picture, or the pictures paint a picture. It's interesting
incredible.
How that's possible. Yeah. They paint lots of words, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And they just of the... It has this element of like after the day after Burning Man or something, where this huge city, fortified city was created, and then it just disappears the next day. And in a way, it is a picture of vandalism, I guess. It almost looks like a place that's been vandalized,
rubbish
and dereliction, exactly. And they left behind a bunch of stuff.
There are worse things the Americans did in Afghanistan.
Yeah, but I think, the metaphor is obvious. I don't need to spell it out too much, but it's like the Americans came in, set up shop, and then just left overnight and left a bunch of crap behind. Didn't tidy their mess, right? Now, there's a kind of conservative, even like neocon interpretation of that, which is like the US should have finished the job. And that was always the argument about the US, about they could, and the argument that they made for themselves, the American authorities, of we can't just leave overnight because the job's not done. But of course, it's completely unclear what the job was, because
what finishing the job
and what
would
finishing
mean.
with the
Yeah.
job would mean, because it's like, does it mean that the Taliban are completely defeated? Does it mean it's set up a stable state? Does it mean that women have rights? Does it mean that it's just basically
Osama bin
stable?
Laden is dead.
Osama bin Laden, exactly.
It's almost like if you don't have any like remit to start with, then you'll never
end up,
know when
you'll
it's
end up
over.
Exactly.
fighting forever. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, so just as a couple of takeaways from this, and we can discuss a little bit more, but it's that the US has lost yet another war, and this was its longest ever war, 20 years nearly. And this idea, and it also paints a picture of the contemporary form of imperialism, which neither implants itself and tries to colonize a country, but nor is it the kind of surgical intervention that it imagines itself to be. So you have this kind of half-assed intervention, hugely costly in human life and in economic terms, but which doesn't really seem to achieve anything. It just treads water for 20 years and then leaves.
Yeah, just to give a bit of background on this base specifically. So at its peak, it had 100,000 US and NATO troops, and it's now got 0. It was America's main base there. It had a Pizza Hut and a Subway and a Green Beans coffee shop. I don't know what Green Beans is, but I'm sure our American listeners will know.
I'm sure it's probably crap coffee anyway.
Yeah. And it had Robin Williams, Jay Leno, and Kid Rock. I don't know, all at the same time. That would have probably been a bit too much for people to take, but they were all there, and they left behind like 3.5 million, 3.5 million items. It's like ranging from like ammunition and small arms to like cars without keys. It's just absolutely staggering. They ghosted Afghanistan and the security forces there. They were basically like, right, we need to go. Like, just switch off the phone.
Gonna turn up like, hey babe, can I get my guitar back? It's like, no, dickhead, get out.
No, it's basically like, switch the phone off, and then when they'd landed in the US, switch it back on. Loads of missed calls and just be like, yeah, I'm back home now. See you never.
So the photos are worth looking at because it's lots of kind of, Afghan shopkeepers draped over the all the stuff that they've kind of looted and picked up, like basketballs and Kevlar body armor and wiring and bits and pieces. But I guess the real question that struck me from thinking about this was, why did the Americans leave in the night and not tell the Afghans? And I'm thinking, so there's a number of reasons you could think for it. So, it might be partly a security decision, assuming the Afghan kind of security forces are kind of riddled with Taliban informants. Maybe they didn't want to let the Taliban know. On the other hand, there was a huge crowd of looters apparently just waiting for the Americans to shut off the lights and to descend on the base. So I imagine lots of people already knew on the ground what was going on.
And it's not exactly totally in the middle of nowhere. It's like an hour from Kabul. So
yeah, and also the Taliban have been observing a ceasefire since the US announced their withdrawal, in which they've only been targeting Afghan national security forces, and they've not been targeting NATO and the US troops. So there's no expectation to imagine that they would have tried and caused trouble for the withdrawal. So if it's not that, then I thought, well, maybe it's to avoid any kind of flag lowering ceremonies or kind of helicopter out of Saigon kind of photos of desperate people trying to clamber on helicopters, and maybe avoid any kind of symbolism which could be captured in a newspaper and embarrass the kind of US government. But on the other hand, they left in the middle of the night. They didn't tell their local allies. And the whole thing appears, it's still kind of slinking away with your tail between your legs. It's astonishing.
I think that's exactly it. I think that's a good argument. I think that's a good case you're making for why they left in the middle of the night. And actually, that's why some of these photos deserve to become iconic, I think, of the kind of a picture of American vandalism and dereliction.
The detritus of empire.
Exactly. And yeah, I think like that picture is one which also runs against what was always the argument for why they couldn't just leave Afghanistan, right? So when anti-war campaigners would say, just get out, but no, but we have a job to finish, it's like, just get out, no, but it'll leave it more mess, we're here now, we have a responsibility, blah, 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 just get out, right? And they said, no, we can't do that. But they did just get out. I mean, they did just leave overnight. And you kind of think, well, that could have been done, and 17 years ago.
It's interesting because the Pentagon, even like their assessment is that there's a medium risk that the Afghan government and its security forces will collapse within the next 2 years.
I think that's what we're understating. I mean, all the reporting says that like the Taliban will gain control pretty quickly.
Yeah, so it's like there is some sort of I guess there is something going on there, that their own rationale, their own intelligence is pointing one way, and we've heard these arguments so frequently over the last however many years. And then the reality is, just to avoid getting which actually could have been quite iconic, some photos of some GIs packing stuff up or I don't know,
or
just
lowering the flag,
or I don't know, you can imagine there just being some, like, there's a basketball hoop, and
it's not quite the mission accomplished moment. It's the mission is over me.
Yeah, but to avoid that, they've gone against, I guess, what could have been like minimal continued justification.
But it ended up looking worse. Like, they slink away in the middle of the night, and then the base, this happens to the base. I mean, and
this was quite widely reported as well. I should note, this isn't just some random little piece that I found. This was across. Yeah.
So apparently, Biden is going to make a statement, which seems like effectively it'll be damage control for all of this. But there is two things I think which are worth saying. So I'm not sure. I mean, there were very few people who said leave immediately, I think, and among the anti-war, so much of the anti-war opposition in terms of, it was criticisms of drone strikes, or criticisms of the way in which the war was conducted, or criticisms of US unilateralism, or criticisms of like they didn't have sufficient kind of local cultural knowledge or whatever. And I remember back in 2001 when the US invaded, it was so hard to make the case that the US shouldn't invade. Given the fact that Afghanistan had been the base for Al-Qaeda, which had launched the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon in September 2001, the idea that there was any alternative to some kind of vast military retribution and the need to kind of destroy Al-Qaeda seemed kind of just, seemed untenable. And yet here we are 20 years later, and it's just been, the war on terror has been a total disaster, not least for Afghanistan itself. And not even that, the Taliban are going to be back in charge, the people who the Americans overran in 2001. So I think that, the fact that the opponents of military intervention were proved right, even if 20 years later, given how difficult it was to make the case against intervention back in 2001, I think that's worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, though, I think the case for immediate withdrawal, was made by anti-war campaigners. Maybe not immediately, don't intervene, because it was very hard to argue against what would have been seen as a policing operation.
It wasn't a uniform kind of demand across the anti-war movement as a whole. No,
sure, but the American authorities responded as if that had been the demand. It's like, no, you're demanding something that is irresponsible. We're there now. We need to finish this job.
I think it's quite clear that there's, leaving in this way indicates a complete lack of interest in taking any responsibility, either for the future of Afghanistan or for the costs of the intervention itself. So I don't think there will be any coming to terms, any holding to account. I think, America probably just wants to forget it, and
it's
and Biden
humiliation and a defeat.
Yeah, and Biden will be like, well, we had to do something, and we did something, and it worked, and now we're gone, and it's not our, kind of wash our hands, not our problem anymore, but they can do whatever they like.
But so they're meeting Trumpian criticisms of US foreign policy that landed, effectively. And so they're trying to claim credit for what was essentially kind of a Trumpian foreign policy initiative.
Bring the troops home.
Bring the troops home. So they kept the troops out.
Bring the troops home.
They kept the troops out, and now they can claim credit for this. So they kind of pulled the rug out from the Trumpian critique of US foreign policy. You don't need the war on terror because you now got an even better war against an invisible enemy that will carry on for years and years and years.
A very small enemy of the people.
A very small enemy.
I think Streeck put it in.
So you get a biosecurity state instead of the war on terror state. And I suppose the other thing as well is the how long will the US puppet government in Kabul last? So the Soviet, when did the Taliban swept in? Well, so it's a question there, right? So everyone assumed that the pro-Soviet government in Kabul would collapse immediately. The Soviets withdrew in 1989. I think the Taliban came in 97, 96, so it lasted about 6 or 7 years before it was overturned. And I imagine
what's your over-under?
So I would say that it will last less. I would say probably about 2 years would be my guess, the Pentagon's kind of estimate. And I think it would probably last less because and this is kind of a bit of history, I guess, but I mean, my guess, this is the way I read the situation, is I think the Afghan Communist Party actually had a base in the Afghan kind of urban middle classes. And this is what allowed it to, they also played off all the tribal kind of militants against each other, and that's what allowed it to survive for a while. Whereas I think that base has probably totally been shredded. So what will be left in Kabul will be the kind of, it'll be an NGO base. It won't be the kind of the developmentalist Afghan middle classes who vested their hopes in communism to develop Afghanistan. It'll be a kind of externally oriented NGO base, and I think that'll be a less solid structure of support for the government to hold on to urban centres, and so I think it'll probably collapse more quickly.
Yeah, good point.
You should just nationalize the opium production and build so export-led development, right?
You've got to take over. You've got to take over that to be able to nationalise it.
That would be opium.
Yeah. No, but
opium of the masses for the masses.
There you
by
go.
The masses.
Just to return quickly to these images, because I think that's what I found most interesting about this piece and the kind of the metaphorical aspects of it, which is the argument about the war on terror and all these interventions was that you could have this sort of seamless, casualty-free war with surgical interventions which would quickly resolve shock and awe, and the regime collapses and democracy springs forth and so on. And here you have the kind of flip side of that, or some sort of mirror image of it, of this seamless, casualty-free ending of a war, or departure from a country, which just happens overnight. And it's almost like a kind of farcical rendition of what the ideologues, the neoconservative ideologues, imagined, this kind of 21st century war on terror to be like.
Yeah, and it's worth. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld, who is so much of the
R.I.P.
architect of the war on terror.
Rest in power.
He's just recently died, kind of expired appropriately around roughly the same time as the war on terror. I mean, we shouldn't exaggerate because the war on terror isn't ended, but one of its main theatres of battle, the Americans have kind of slunk away from, and the Islamists looks like they're going to take over Afghanistan again.
Yeah, I mean, this actually isn't a very significant point, but Subway is the chain with the most number of stores in the world. So they have presumably one fewer now, or maybe they will still be operating it. But that's a bit of factoid.
Well, so I mean, this is why Subway is inferior, because no two countries with McDonald's could ever go to war with one another. A certain theory held, whereas countries with Subway certainly could. So.
I thought you were going to say it was inferior to Pret, because I do like a Pret sandwich.
What's wrong with Subway? Why is the snobbery against this hearty and Hale healthy
if you have meat and bread, it should be a sandwich cut diagonally, ideally. That's what that's the way to do it. I don't know why the snobbery against Subway. I think meatball marinara is nice.
I feel so nauseous every time I eat a Subway. I don't know what they put in there, there's something about it where I'm
it's got more fat and salt than a Big Mac.
It's your delicate cosmopolitan constitution.
It lacks oomph and freshness.
Yeah.
It very much does. Oomph and freshness. We hope you found that with us. If this is your first time with us, just a couple of announcements, I guess. We have a book out. You probably know this already. It's called The End of History, Politics in the 21st Century. It's out with 0 books right now, and you can buy a copy from all good and bad retailers. You know who I'm talking about. So there's that, and we're also going to launch the book in real life. We can be almost in touching distance to one another, you and I, listener, if that's of any interest. We are.
How much does it cost? Tell
it's
our
free.
listeners
It's free.
how much
it's even better. Even better.
If you
it's
sign
free.
up to the $30 Patreon.
You definitely get touching. We're going to be doing that in London on the 24th of July. That's a Saturday. If you're in London or around the southeast of England, do travel in, come see us, have a drink with us, come celebrate. It'll be a little book launch / bunga party. And it'll be just by Russell Square Tube. The information is in the show notes. It's also on our Facebook page and so on. So do join us. We hope to see you there and get to know you in person. That'll be fun. Also, finally, if you do like this 3 articles, we do plenty of these on Patreon. And if you're interested in signing up, it's patreon.com/bungacast. You know what the score is by this stage. All right, that's it from us for now. Catch you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
There's just, you gotta be just right in there.
No, I like to kind of imagine the listener.
Hang back and feebly give a little wave.
The listener's like just about to take off their headphones or pause and like, bye.
Wait, did you say something? Oh no, I was just saying bye. Oh, okay. Right. So bye then. Yeah. So no, actually never mind. I'll tell you when I next see you. So bye.
Yes, the most annoying way to end a conversation.
Keep them on their toes. They think it's all over. It is now when I say bye. Anyway, there you go.